Okay. First of all, thank you very much for joining. Michael Makowski. I'm the president, CEO of GINSA. I'm joined by two colleagues of mine, retired IDF Major General Yaakov Amidjor, is Distinguished Fellow here in our Munder Center, former National Security Advisor in Israel to Prime Minister Netanyahu. I'm also joined by my colleague, John Hanna, Senior Fellow at GINSA. He's the Randy and Charles Wax Senior Fellow with us. And I guess his last government position was a National Security Advisor to Vice President Cheney. Thank you for joining us. We thought that it was important to take a pause and get a sense of what's going on in the U.S.-Israel relations, given that there seems to be increasing fraying of those ties in the last few months, and it seems to have, at least come to at least a head for now. Whether it's an interim head, it's just a blip that will then go down. Time will tell, but things have seemed to have really kind of unraveled lately. So we want to discuss that first. I'm actually, before I get to questions, and this time usually I start with one of our generals. This time we're going to start with John Hanna, but I want to just say, just to go back, just to recap for everyone. I'm sure all of you have been following this closely, but in the last few days, what have we seen this week? We saw a UN Security Council resolution that the U.S. was behind but abstained from. That did call for here, and I'm going to read the text in front of me. It says, demands an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, respected by all parties, leading to a lasting, sustainable ceasefire, and also demands the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as well as ensuring humanitarian access, etc. I think, and the Israelis, the U.S. abstained. The Israelis clearly objected to this language because until this resolution of the other day, the U.S. has always said there can only be a more lasting ceasefire once the hostages are released. And here, they're both mentioned in the same sentence, but the ceasefire is not conditioned on the release of the hostages. So Israel clearly objected strongly to this, canceled sending a delegation of Minister for Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, a former GINSA Distinguished Fellow, I may add, and Tzachi Hanegbi, the National Security Advisor in Israel. This was they were supposed to come to Washington this week at the invitation of President Biden to discuss U.S. ideas of how Israel should handle the Rafah situation. Generally, and of course, this week's events have been preceded in recent weeks by a speech on the Senate floor by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who happens to be Jewish, who effectively pushing for new elections and effectively saying there needs to be that Prime Minister Netanyahu has kind of lost credibility and there has to be new elections, which caused a firestorm in Israel. Even those who opposed Netanyahu objected to this speech. But President Biden said he thought it was a good speech. And just to go back in time a little longer, and then I'll get to my question to John, and then we'll go to the General Amidjor. It seems to me, John, that the first crack, President Biden on October 7th and for subsequent months has been terrific. On Israel stood by it, but I recall seeing a poll in early November saying that he lost in October 11 percentage points of support among Democrats just in the month of October, which clearly must have gotten the attention of this White House. And then we have seen, certainly in February, and you and I wrote about this, he sent a Deputy National Security Advisor to Dearborn, Michigan, to apologize to Arab Americans to try to communicate that the administration did not adequately show enough support publicly for the concern of the Palestinians. And it seems that the administration, and the concern is, of course, that the administration seems very focused. They're afraid to lose Michigan and maybe a couple other states that could cost Biden re-election. He's worried about his progressive wing base of his party, which is more hostile to Israel. And increasingly, the focus is on Rafah, concern that an Israeli ground operation to take Rafah, which the Israelis see as important to knock off Hamas and to defeat Hamas, could cause a lot of humanitarian suffering, causes him more problems politically with his left-wing base. And there seems to be increasing opposition in the administration to that. That seems to be what's been going on that I could see in the last couple of months. How do you assess what is going on, at least from the U.S. perspective? And then we'll go to General Amidjor on the Israeli side on what's been going on with Israel and the ties, because they've really deteriorated.
Yeah, no, it's worrying. I think you're right. I think so much of this has to do with the president's interpretation of his own domestic political situation. We're now obviously already in campaign mode, and his political advisors seem to have convinced him that a dramatic pivot was required in his position on Israel and the war, at least in terms of his public rhetoric on this, if not real American actions on the ground. But they seem to have convinced him that this is very politically costly to him, not only amongst Arab Americans who may be important in Michigan, maybe another state or two, I don't know, but also amongst young Americans, that 18 to 29 demographic who they seem to be having a real problem with. And the antidote to this, they seem to have convinced him, is to shift to a much tougher, much sharper, much more shrill critique of Israel's war effort in Gaza. Not enough humanitarian aid, too many Palestinians being killed. President used the words over the top in terms of Israel's reaction, which was 180 degrees different from his reaction on October 7th, 8th, and 9th in the weeks that followed, where he made clear if this had happened to the United States, our response would have been overwhelming and swift, probably even greater than what Israel did. So my own sense of this is that while he's trying to avoid electoral defeat, he through this kind of unfair, shrill, inaccurate critique of what Israel is doing in Gaza. And for anybody who really wants to understand what Israel is doing in Gaza, I would recommend this article by John Spencer, who heads up the Urban Warfare Institute at West Point, where he said Israel, in fact, is setting a new standard for conducting urban warfare and caring for innocent lives of enemy civilians. That's, in fact, a far more accurate account of what's been happening than what the administration has been putting forward for the past several weeks. So I'm afraid the president is both choosing kind of a dishonorable attack on Israel that is actually going to end up losing him or making his reelection more difficult, because I think it can only give heart to Hamas and the Iranian axis. I think it will only prolong the war. It will result in more misery for Palestinians, more deaths for Israelis. It will bring the horrors of this war, extend them out closer to the election in a way that will never, ever appease his critics within the progressive base of the Democratic Party, who really do want their ultimate aim here is for a major rupture in the U.S.-Israel relationship. Simply harsher critiques of Israel, abstaining from a UN resolution is only going to feed this monster and feed this beast, just as it feeds the beast of Hamas and the Iranian axis of resistance to believe that they've in fact hit upon a winning strategy here. And instead of facing a potential U.S.-Israeli wartime alliance that is going to deliver an overwhelming defeat to Iran and its proxy strategy, that if they hold out long enough, they maybe, just maybe, can achieve something more like a historic victory by rupturing this absolutely critical relationship to both the United States and Israel, rupturing that bilateral alliance in a way that's going to weaken Israel significantly. And I fear that the president is playing into that real problem now that he faces in the Democratic Party.
General Amidjor, first of all, I want you to address this from the Israeli perspective, obviously comment on anything John said, but I'd like to just to start on the mic on just on this one instance. What did you think of, what do you think the Israeli government, or at least Prime Minister Netanyahu, was trying to do when he canceled this delegation of Dermer and Tzachi Hanegbi going to Washington, although now there are reports that he's trying to reschedule it. What message was he trying to send, you think, when he did that? And
I think that the interest of Israel was to signal clearly to the Americans that their decision not to veto the decision in the United Nations is harming the efforts of Israel to dismantle Hamas, and will give Hamas hope that he can survive. It will make the whole negotiations with Hamas about the hostages much more complicated, because if America does not stand with Israel, Hamas can feel that he can be a more extremist in his demands from Israel. The part of the abilities of Israel is the fact that it was known from the beginning, thanks to the decision of President Biden, that America is supporting Israel efforts in the war and standing behind Israel in the international community. One element had been lost in the decision not to veto the decision, which was almost parallel to one which was vetoed by the United States of America a few days before, which was offered by America before and was vetoed by Moscow and Beijing. And what happened is that the Americans went towards the Russians and the Chinese, neglecting the Israeli demand that any ceasefire will be conditional. If there is a deal to release the hostages, we agree to a ceasefire. Here was a separation between the two. And in the decision itself, there is no any condemnation to Hamas. Israel and Hamas are on the same level morally, something that government of Israel cannot agree to. And the signal was done by canceling the visit of Minister Dermer and the National Security Advisor Hanegbi. At the end, everyone in Israel knows that America is the most important ally of Israel. No one can ignore it, and no one wants to lose it. But the step of showing that there are some decisions that cannot be accepted by Israel was a very important one, because in this relation, Israel is the little country. In this case, it's the more needed country. And we were very much surprised by the change in the policy of the United States of America, which came out when it was we didn't put any condition to the ceasefire and put Israel and Hamas on the same level because they didn't condemn Hamas in the decision. And the Americans didn't veto it. I think that that was the reason why the Prime Minister made this decision. I hope that the signal was understood in Washington. From what I heard today from the spokesman of the National Security, Mr. Kirby in Washington, I understand that it is now closer to what Israel had in mind relating to Rafah, which is, from our point of view, it's a need which we are not going to give up. We will go into Rafah. We will dismantle the 4 battalions there because it is part of the operation. It is needed to show Hamas that Hamas as organization is not accepted in the Gaza Strip, and for that we have to Rafah, and we will do it.
So let me come back to you. But let me go to John for a second, and I want to come back to you, General. John, do you think, as General Amidjor said, that it was this sort of signal? How does, in your experience, do you think that, here's the President of the United States asking that Israel sends these officials, and you would think when there's tension between the two countries, you would want to send, Israel would be in Israel's interest to send someone, especially someone like, Dermer and Hanegbi, 2 senior officials to help try to get past this tension. Do you think then when Israel does something like this, that, it certainly has a bit of a jarring effect that, it will be, while surprising, but ultimately constructive and getting people's attention in Washington, or does it hurt Israel's interests, you think, when it does something like this?
Hard to know, hard to put myself in the place of people in the Biden administration and how they're thinking about this problem. I've got to say, I'm kind of, I understand that Israelis were surprised by what happened on Monday, but I've got to say, watching as the kind of series of events that you laid out over recent weeks, the notion that we might be heading toward this kind of abstention in the Security Council as a potential card that the Americans were willing to play, given what was obvious, the growing frustration on the part of the Biden administration, justified or not. Frankly, I was deeply disappointed, but I'm not sure I was surprised by what the administration did on Monday. I think it's terribly counterproductive. I think it's not going to serve them well in the end, neither electorally nor from the standpoint of U.S. national interest, but I'm not sure I was surprised by it. One hopes, I totally understand that this was a bridge too far for Israel. One hopes that there were lots of discussions when this resolution was first proffered by the 10 non-permanent members of the Security Council, and there was a lot of back and forth, and hopefully some understandings reached between the United States and Israel in advance of Monday, and that Israel wasn't totally shocked and taken by surprise by the American decision to abstain. But, I don't know what the nature Israel registered its objection. I hope it was very strong, and the administration shouldn't have been surprised when the Prime Minister decided he needed a public message to be sent by holding back that delegation. Strategically, I think, of course, these conversations need to happen. These differences need to, as hard as they are and as angry as people are, they need to iron out these differences, because it's in Israel's interest, and it's absolutely in America's interest that Israel succeed in this war. This ultimately is a war not between, at least for the United States, between Israelis and Israelis and Palestinians. It is a war between 2 major alliances. This is an Iranian alliance fighting to determine the future order of the Middle East, and an American alliance. And behind the Iranian alliance are the Russians and the Chinese, precisely the people who applauded this resolution on Monday. So if the United States, it needs to understand those are the stakes, and that Israel's victory over Hamas will be a victory over this Iranian alliance, that Israel is in fact fighting on the front lines for America and needs to succeed in this war. And that's the way we need to conduct the relations between us, even when we have differences. The only saving grace, I'd say, is that we had a separate visit at exactly the same time by the Israeli defense minister, a former major general in the IDF, who understands exactly what Israel plans to do in Rafah, could talk very directly to his American counterparts about Israel's plans and hear whatever ideas they have about how to do the operation better than Israel is planning. I've got to say, I'm deeply skeptical that the United States actually has such a better plan. My guess is if it actually had these ideas, we would have known about them or heard about them long ago. So I understand what Israel did, but I think, as soon as possible, we need to both get on the track of ironing out these differences of these two leaders who both clearly have hard domestic politics that they have to manage, who are longtime friends, who are seasoned politicians, need to figure out, given our common interests in defeating Hamas, defeating Iran's proxy strategy in the Middle East, how do we help each other manage those domestic problems and yet fulfill our common national interest?
Yeah. General, let me ask you, do you agree with what John just said about they got back to this, they got to send this delegation? Two, I wanted to ask you also, do you agree with what John said in his previous remarks, that this just seems to be the administration's approach is just slowing up what seems, as you pointed out, is the inevitable Israeli incursion into Rafah, the last main bastion of Hamas support, and they're just unnecessarily prolonging what needs to be done?
Up till now, we had another reason why not to go to Rafah. We didn't want to interrupt in the negotiations about the hostages. We didn't want to make an act that will be an excuse for Hamas to stop it. I understand, in spite of the fact that formally it is still going on, practically the Hamas refused to all the efforts of the United States of America and Israel. Israel accepted the American compromise and Hamas rejected it. So practically, probably it's the end of negotiation in this stage. If that is true, Israel will accelerate its preparations to go to Rafah. We know that the first stage will be to move the million people which came into the south from the center and the north when Israel invaded the Gaza Strip, and we have to evacuate at least a million of them. The numbers are growing in Rafah all the time. The first people spoke about 1 million. After that, they spoke about 1,000,002, and then they spoke about 1,004,000. Today, the number which is 1,005,000. I mean, if you take all the numbers, you understand that no one knows what is the exact numbers, but the area should be clear and ready for a military operation. We cannot make it when there are a million civilians around the Rafah. So it will take, I don't know, a week, 2 or 3 to move them, and only then Israel will go into Rafah. Before that, we have to complete the operation in Khan Yunis and the suburbs of Khan Yunis. We are now towards the end. It was supposed to end a week or 2 ago, but the intelligence which was collected on the ground led to other places that should be cleaned before we are pulling out our forces from Khan Yunis, but it is probably towards the end. And then the operation to move the population probably will begin within 2 weeks, immediately after the Ramadan.
Look, one other point, and I want to ask you about Rafah, and of course we do our weekly Zooms on the war on Thursdays, and we moved, at least for you, at least General, we wanted to do it today. But how do you, your point, John's point, I'd be curious if you could address how you know, that this is really a war that Israel is fighting to the benefit that's important for U.S. interests, that they succeed. They're effectively a fight. I don't mean to, John could repeat himself, but just to put words in John's mouth, effectively a fight between these two axes, the Iran axis on one side, the U.S. aligned axis on the other. It seems like that message that Israel seems to be trying to communicate sometimes is just not getting across here in Washington. I don't know. What's your sense from Israel perspective?
I can tell you, I spoke in the last few weeks with, I don't know, almost 1,000 guys in uniform in Israel, in many places, not many, few places, from generals to cadets in the IDF. And I'm telling everyone that the war that they are fighting in Gaza, some of them came out from Gaza a few days before I spoke with them, is a different war. It is a three-level war. The first one and the most understood one is about our security, that people around Gaza can live and flourish, that someone in Gaza cannot make a decision every 3 weeks, every 3 years that I will run to the shelter. It's about security. And for this, we have to dismantle and to destroy the military capability of Hamas, as was ordered by the government. I'm quoting from the government decision. But there is a second level. And this is about the position of Israel in the Middle East and in the world. In the 7th of October, Israel lost something very important. The best intelligence agency in the world didn't work. We didn't have the alarm, and we didn't understand what's going on the other side. The strongest army in the Middle East didn't fulfill its mission, being the defend Israel. And it is clear that Israel lost its position in the Middle East, which was based on the fact that everyone appreciates the strong country with very good intelligence and very good military forces. What we are doing now in Gaza is to repurchase our position. We are building back our position by winning the war. And in this case, the war not just should be, the victory not just be clear, it should be very visual. It will be understood who is losing and who is winning. And part of it is to dismantle the forces in Rafah. Otherwise, they will come out from Rafah and will say, "Hi guys, we survived. With all the Israeli mighty forces, we survived." No, it will not happen. They will be destroyed in Rafah. And the third level, that people in Israel ignoring totally because they don't understand it, was understood very well by President Biden. He was the first to understand it, that this is a war between axes. It's the Moscow, Tehran, Hezbollah, Hamas axis, when the Chinese are sitting on the balcony and smiling because the alliance of the United States of America, Israel, Riyadh, and the Emirates was get a huge blow. And he understood, and he sent the carrier, and he said, "Don't. We don't need the carrier to fight against Hamas. We don't need the carrier to fight against Hezbollah," with all due respect to both of them. The carrier was the American to show the world in Ukraine, in North Korea, in Japan, in Taiwan, alliances of America will get the support of America if we'll be in it. And the carrier in the Mediterranean was for that, to show that America is standing with its allies. This is why I don't understand the shift of the position of the United States of America in the last vote in the United Nations, because that was a clear message. We don't stand with our allies. Does everyone in America understand it? That Israel is fighting for the axis, not just for itself? At the same war, the soldiers fighting in Gaza are fighting 3 levels war. It's about the security of the Israelis, it's about the position of Israel, and it's about the axis. And I think it's very important that, and I think that part of the support of the United States of America is not just because of the good relations with Israel and commitment of the Americans to the security of Israel, it is also about the need to show that the axis works very well. And it will be clear that it works very well only if Israel wins completely, clearly, and very visually. And we are ready to sacrifice soldiers for that. And we don't ask any American to fight with us. We said we will, Israel will defend itself by itself. We meant it, and we stand behind it. And we don't ask any American soldiers to fight for us. What we need is a lot of munition, because the war is very complicated.
You know, I can't help it here, but you know, Winston Churchill said in the Battle of Britain, you know, we might be fighting for our by ourselves alone, but we are not fighting for ourselves alone. But yet, I
don't argue with you about Churchill, you know it.
Thank you. I appreciate this one area, General, that you give me a little deference. I appreciate that. So I was John. Colleague showed me that there's a March. There was a poll that just came out today by Gallup that had indicated 55% of Americans disapprove of Israel's military response in Gaza, a 10 percentage point increase since November. And I guess, and there are other subparts of this that suggest weakening U.S. popular support for Israel. I've also seen other polls that suggest more consistent, overwhelming U.S. support, American support for Israel. But I guess the question is, going back to what done before, do you think what the Biden administration's, the rising criticism from the administration in the last, I don't know, say 6 weeks or so or more of Israel, that it's having an impact on how Americans are looking at Israel right now?
Well, I mean, certainly to the extent that Americans are paying attention, and I don't think they do at any great level. I think having, you know, on foreign affairs, the people that they tend to listen to, the only people they hear tend to be the president, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the Defense Secretary. They're not talking or hearing on their nightly news from a lot of congressmen. So it's the administration that makes the news and that sets the tone, that has the bully pulpit, particularly on foreign policy issues. So it certainly is no help to that. I can't say that the Republican presumed candidate for president has been any stronger. So they're not hearing alternative voices. They're not hearing that kind of framing that General Amidjor just presented, that this is a fight for American national security and national interests. It's absolutely critical that our ally, our partner, one of our best friends in the world, defeats the proxies of Iran in this battle. They're not hearing that kind of framing and understanding how much we have at stake here in this war and Israel's success. So the fact that I don't, as you say, there are polls that are kind of have been all over the place. So I'm not sure what we can really trust at any point in time. But if there is a general trend line of people getting tired of this war, people, they've forgotten about October the 7th, to the extent they see anything on their TVs, it's about Palestinian suffering. And they've got a president and Secretary of State and National Security Advisor warning Israel about its conduct of this war, that it's somehow inappropriate, they're killing too many people, they're not allowing enough humanitarian aid in, it wouldn't surprise me if the overall trend line amongst a population that remains very, very pro-Israel and could easily, I think, be led in a very, very pro-Israel, finish this war, destroy Hamas direction. It's not surprising in the environment that I think we've been in the last couple of months, including the president's State of the Union, that was all about 90% of what he said about the Gaza conflict was a criticism of Israel, that the population in general, when they get asked by a pollster, tends to register, well, doesn't look like it's going great. I'm not sure I like what's happening.
Do you think that, and then do you think, John, that U.S. officials appreciate that how they treat Israel is registers with other friends and allies of the United States? What I mean by that is that my sense is, and tell me if you're wrong, that a lot of foreign governments look at the bilateral U.S.-Israel relationship as an important barometer for how America stands by its friends. And if it's not standing by Israel, it is then seen by many other countries that America is not going to stand by other allies of the United States.
I think that's certainly the case. I think Israel is always the canary in the coal mine. Everybody else is watching. This is it is a special, historically special kind of relationship between the United States and the only Jewish state in the world. We are Israel's bulwark through Democratic administrations, Republican administrations, and to the extent that not even Israel can depend on the United States, even just less than 6 months after suffering the darkest day in its history, one of the most heinous kinds of attacks any country in modern times has faced on its civilian population, that within a matter of 6 months, United States will and reliability and dependability will weaken and resolve will weaken because of criticism it's getting domestically. I think that's a very, very bad message. Now, having said that, I would say that for all of our allies in the Arab world, who I think would love for Israel to destroy Hamas as quickly, yesterday, as quickly as possible, none of them are profiles encouraged. They're all standing up, criticizing America. They're telling America, you need to end this war for us. It's too painful for us. So I don't think, none of them help as much as they want to see Israel destroyed, as much as they will want to see America standing by its allies and being a dependable friend of Israel when it comes to actually supporting the United States and encouraging it to play its appropriate role internationally. They're all concerned, scared of their own shadows, scared of their own domestic populations, and no doubt being both privately and publicly critical of the United States and our support for Israel.
General, first of all, by the way, I should point out, as far as I understand, the weapons, the resupply from the Biden administration to Israel has continued. So despite the tension that we're seeing in the rhetoric and in other parts of this relationship, it seems like the mill-mill relationship is continuing decently. Let me ask you, General, do you think, and obviously, as you point out, the war is not over, Israel needs to go on to Rafah. I wonder, I guess there were good reasons why Israel waited this long to go into Rafah, but I wonder when all this is said and done and we're finished with this, that there'll be some assessment in Israel and saying, well, maybe these kind of things need to be done more quickly, and that the longer Israel, which is not used to long wars, when they do have long wars, it only works against them because opposition builds even among its closest ally, the United States. I don't know. What do you think?
It's a very good question. I want to say something about the war itself and why it is very slow. I mean, it took us a long time to take the north part, and then we are fighting for a long time in Khan Yunis, and we are not. First of all, you have to take into consideration that Israel is preparing at the same time, parallel to the war in Gaza, to might be a war in Lebanon. So we cannot take all our forces and to invest them inside Gaza. From the beginning, we had to keep enough forces that if something bad happens in the north, we will have the ability to move forces from the south to the north, and at least one division waited outside the Gaza Strip to an order for a long time before it was used inside, because we wanted to keep the flexibility. So when you speak about Gaza, you have to remember we have a huge challenge in the north. Most of the forces there were recruited in the first few days based on the reserve forces of Israel. But all the time we have to take into consideration the fact that we might need forces in the north. First. Second, the war is very slow because it's first time in history probably that the IDF is fighting in two levels all the time. The mass, the armor, the infantry is fighting on the ground, and huge infantry and special forces are fighting under the ground in the tunnels, and you have to coordinate between the two. You cannot run on the ground and find yourself that under the ground there are your enemy is still active and can come out of the access out of the tunnels to attack you. And at the same time, you cannot run under the ground and you find yourself that your enemy is on you. And to coordinate those efforts, it's very complicated. We build new techniques. We build new system to work together, and we are fighting inside the tunnels. It's not that we are coming to a point, blowing it and going. No, we are fighting inside the tunnels. Today, we are prolonging the operation in Khan Yunis because we found another 5 entrances to tunnels in Khan Yunis, and we are calling to investigate it, but it's not investigation. We have to go with technology and then soldiers into the tunnels to find what there is under the ground. Headquarters, center of command, terrorists, maybe hostages, we don't know. So the war itself is very slow, unlike in my history in the IDF. Here, slow is part of the new DNA of the war in situations in which you have to fight in two levels, parallel, coordinated between the two levels, all the time taking into account the fact that hostages might be around. So it's very slow. And the war in Rafah will be the same. We will go to Rafah very slowly, with a lot of combination between the air support and the ground forces. The Israeli Air Force became Army Air Force. They are supporting the operation on the ground very close. There are representatives of the Air Force in every battalion or every brigade to coordinate it. But the main reason for being so slow is not just the ability to bring more fire into the battlefield if you stop. It is about fighting in parallel under the ground and on the ground. Maybe first time in history, I don't know. This operation will be learned in the future in all the military schools. It's very unique, very technological. It's kind of a start-up war with many innovations during the war, a lot of flexibility because we found challenges that we didn't have knowledge how to deal with. Remember, the IDF was much better prepared for the war in the north against Hezbollah, not about taking taking Gaza. Taking Gaza is a result of the seventh attack of Hamas. And yes, it's a very slow process, and it will continue to be slow. But what is the but here? If you would ask people in my age a year ago, how many casualties the IDF will have taking Gaza? The answer was probably between 600 and 2,000. And thank God, today we have 250. We have less casualties taking 80% of the Gaza Strip than Hezbollah has without moving 1 inch from the border. So the achievement is not just that we succeeded to dismantle Hamas, but the price is much lower than was expected before the war. But the war itself, the operation itself is very slow.
Yeah. Look, you point out correctly about Lebanon, obviously Israel, the extensiveness of the tunnels was greater than Israel, I think, expected.
No question.
And then these hostage negotiations, which Israel is keen on, has obviously slowed up the tempo of the war. And, you know, stuff happens in war, obviously, and far be it from me in the United States to, you know, raise questions. I will say when we were in Israel and John and I were there together in early December, we were told that they thought major operations in Israel would be over by the end of January. Obviously, that's not happening. That hasn't happened. But I still wonder about the question of why Rafah wasn't, you know, attacked earlier on in the war. But I guess we'll find out more once this is over. I guess, John.
I can tell you, I learned from experience that the best military plan is the one which was not implemented.
Yeah. Right. And by the way, as you point out correctly, General, which is not to be minimized, as terrible as the 250 or whatever is 251 or 252 IDF deaths in the ground incursion, it is much lower, as you point out, than was feared by the IDF at the beginning of this war. And it's a war that Israel didn't seek. So, which has obviously impacted how they've responded to it. I guess, John, I mean, just in the last few minutes, if any concluding remarks, how do you see, it seems like they want to reschedule this meeting, sending Minister Ron Dermer and Tzachi Hanegbi to Israel, to Washington, excuse me. Maybe Netanyahu has made his point to the White House after the series of anti-Netanyahu and anti-Israel comments by senior officials in Congress and in the White House. I don't know. How do you see where we're going to be going in the near term with this bilateral relationship?
Well, we'll see. I mean, there's, you know, a couple of levels. If you believe the reports coming out in the Wall Street Journal about Defense Minister Gallant's actual meetings at the Pentagon, it sounds like they were quite constructive. The U.S. had ideas about the Rafah operation. Israel presented its ideas. Both seemed committed that, yes, Hamas needs to be defeated. There are some questions about how you do it, but the big question, it seems to me, again, is something we hold in common, is that we got to do something, whether it's 1 million or 1.3 million people, civilians. We got to figure out how to move them out and take care of them to the best of our ability so the IDF can operate as effectively as possible in Rafah and get that operation done as quickly as possible to destroy Hamas. So I would think we, you know, hopefully going forward, we'll work together hard to figure out what do we do to take care of that civilian population as best as we can, together with the rest of the international community who's got a responsibility. They're all talking about taking care of Palestinian civilians. They need to step up and help actually solve that problem so Israel can do the job of defeating Hamas. I hope that's where this headed, and we'll just have to see. But I do, you know, think it's worth mentioning that there is the larger strategic problem here, and the elephant in the room is the Democratic Party, I think, and the long-term trends in the party and just how poisonous and toxic it is, unfortunately, in one of our major parties. The whole question of Israel as a bipartisan issue and the U.S.-Israel relationship as a bipartisan issue, especially after October 7th, that seems to be breaking down. We've all said amongst ourselves that, Biden was very good after October 7th. It seemed to come out of his gut. It was, the last vestiges of Harry Truman kind of coming forth. But we're not at all sure. None of us can name a single individual, major leader figure in the Democratic Party who we would be prepared to become the next major steward of the U.S.-Israel relationship. We're all extremely nervous about that. And that seems to me a real problem. I don't know how it gets fixed within the Democratic Party. Republican Party, of course, has its own issues and problems, but this issue that Jinsa cares so much about, which is the protection and advancement and deepening of the U.S.-Israel strategic partnership, understanding how important that is to Israel, to the United States, to the West, and even to Western civilization and the future of our countries. I'm afraid that could be weakening, particularly in the Democratic Party. And I think it's something that we all got to think long and hard about. What do we do? How do we fix that?
I would add, I remember thinking during the State of the Union address that we might be already in the post-Biden period. Even though he's the president, if you look at October 7th and his initial reaction is coming from his gut and how he acted for weeks on end, that was the real Biden. It seems like we're seeing in recent weeks and the last couple months, almost like a post-Biden, that he is actually overseeing, because this seems to be, as you say, where the Democratic Party is heading. Let me ask you one final question, General, and it's not really about the U.S., it's about the war campaign. If Israel needs to go into Rafah, as you have said, as Netanyahu said, as Ron Dermer said, as every senior Israeli general that I saw when I was in Israel last month, they got to go to Rafah. Victory requires them to go. Why aren't they starting already to work on trying to move some of the civilians out of Rafah now, which is going to take a few weeks? Or is that just something that you do? I don't know, when does that start to happen then?
If you give you the opportunity, I want to quote someone who with whom I spoke today and who said that the relations between the IDF and CENTCOM were never as good as they are today.
Yeah.
So with all the questions about policy and decisions and so on and so forth, when it is coming to the relations between the IDF and CENTCOM, and this is coming from the Pentagon, of course, the relations never had been so good, and the cooperation was never so good about many issues, from building the pier in Gaza to war against the Houthis and the continuation of arriving of munition to Israel and so on and so forth. So I think it's very important to mention again and again, and the feeling of the how Israel thanks the United States of America for this cooperation, which allow us to conduct the war. And as we said, we will defend ourselves by ourselves, but we need your help in everything which is not boots on the ground.
And the weapons are still flowing right now.
Yeah, the weapon is still flowing, yes. About Rafah, I think that now we will see if Ron and Hanegbi will go to Washington next week. No one will begin here something before they are coming back with all the good advisors of the United States of America. Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense, will come back with his meetings in the Pentagon with the same recommendation, probably. I'm sure that everyone here will take it very seriously, and we see what can be injected into our plan which had been prepared by the IDF, and I know from the IDF that their plans were finished. They have it was approved by all the ranks, and now they have to get the order to implement. I think it will take a week when they will come back, and we will see what can be adopted by us into our plans and so on and so forth. And then I believe that we should be very sensitive not to begin it before the end of the Ramadan. We have other problems in other places that we should be very sensitive to the Ramadan. Up till now, everything is okay. In the West Bank, it's relatively quiet, and I hope that it will not be raised or ignited by the operation in Gaza. And if we have to wait another 10 days, another week, it's okay. And immediately afterwards, we have to begin the operation to move the civilians. By the way, it should be one tact after the operation in Khan Yunis, because part of the people will be asked to move to Khan Yunis, which will be designated as a safe haven. So it's very much each step is connected to the previous one, and then we'll go into Rafah, and Rafah will be dismantled as the north part of Gaza.
I'll just conclude by, I appreciate what you said, General, about CENTCOM. It is an important point to emphasize that Israel is part of the area of responsibility of the U.S. Central Command. That's our Mideast Command. That was something that Jintzat first raised in 2018 and really pushed for after the Abraham Accords in 2020. And President Trump approved it in January 2021. And every meeting I have with a senior Israeli general, I always ask the same question: how's your relationship with CENTCOM? And they all say it's excellent. And as good as the relationship was between our two countries' militaries, Israel being part of the Central Command's area of responsibilities even seemed to bring our two militaries even closer. And on that note, also, I'll remind the audience what we emailed about last week, which is that we were honored to have General Frank McKenzie, the previous CENTCOM commander, who joined us in our annual Generals and Admirals trip to Israel last year. He joined us now as a distinguished, the Hertog Distinguished Fellow at our Gemunder Center. So, and he's going to be doing a bunch of work with us on U.S. security issues in the region. We're really honored to have General McKenzie. And then my final point, which we really didn't talk about in this webinar, but maybe we'll do in the future webinars, how is this calendar, how the war is dragging on, maybe slower than we all had expected, but as General Amidjor pointed out, at lower casualty levels, at least on the Israeli side, how is that impacting really the opportunities that were right there, and they're still there, I think, for a Saudi-U.S. normalization. But we'll have to leave that for another webinar, though we'll leave that as a teaser. And I want to thank John and General Amidjor for joining us and discussing this very timely issues of U.S.-Israel relations. I want to thank you all.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and look forward to other future GINSA webinars soon. Thank you. Have a good rest of the day, and a good night there, General. Okay, bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.